The story around staying single has changed. It used to be about waiting, the right person, the right time. Now there's a different version. Some people simply don't want it. They've built a life they genuinely like. They chose this. And that's real. People who actively identify as choosing single life tend to feel better about that status than people who feel single by circumstance. Studies haven't found it makes them healthier or happier overall. The well-being profiles between the two groups are closer than the cultural story suggests, but the sense of ownership around the choice seems to matter. The question is, what's actually inside that word, choice? Two people can say almost the same thing. I like my independence. I value my space. I'm genuinely fine on my own. One of them is telling the complete truth, freely, from somewhere secure. The other is doing something more complicated, something that feels exactly like a free choice, but is actually a very old protection, making sure it never has to be tested. The difference isn't visible from outside. Sometimes it isn't visible from inside either.
If you've lived inside that story for a while, this is just who I am, I prefer being alone, there's a question that's hard to sit with. How would you know the difference? How would you know whether that preference is genuinely yours or whether it developed in a period when needing people kept not going well? Protection worn long enough doesn't feel like armor, it feels like personality. Here's where the two things diverge. Genuine independence doesn't flinch at closeness. It can accept help without something tightening inside. It can sit with someone's care without looking for a reason to redirect it. The choice to be alone is real, but it's flexible. It doesn't need defending. The other kind develops differently. It tends to emerge from a longer history, one where expressing needs consistently led somewhere unhelpful, unavailability, dismissal. The quiet, repeated message that needing was a burden or a weakness. The response becomes stop needing. Repeated enough, that response stops feeling like a response. It just feels like who you are. So how do they look different from the outside? Usually, they don't.
Picture someone in their early 30s, comfortably single, genuinely so, by their own account. They meet someone at a small dinner, real conversation, actual chemistry, the kind that doesn't happen often. On the drive home, there's a flicker, something that feels like possibility. Over the next few days, the architecture reasserts itself. A little too eager, probably not looking for the same things, timing isn't right, they don't follow up. They tell a friend, I liked them, but I'm really happy where I am. And they mean it. That's what's worth staying with. They genuinely mean it. Here's what tends to happen internally when that second kind is running. When closeness increases, when someone expresses real investment, something shifts before any conscious decision is made. Some studies have observed heightened stress markers in people with strong self-reliant patterns when closeness increases, though results vary by individual and context. The body registers something the reasoning hasn't caught up to yet. What's the mind doing, meanwhile? Building a case. Something feels slightly off. Flaws that weren't noticeable before become suddenly salient. A gradual pull toward distance, which arrives dressed as a considered conclusion. This isn't right for me. The protection can feel indistinguishable from clarity.
Here's what the pattern tends to look like from the inside. When someone expresses real care, not casual affection, but I want to know you, the first response isn't warmth. There's something quieter underneath it, a subtle tightening, a pull to minimize it, to redirect it, to quietly reframe their feeling is slightly too much. Not a conscious decision, just a reflex that arrives before the reasoning does. When someone offers help, genuine, uncomplicated help, there's a discomfort that doesn't quite make sense. Not ingratitude, something more like a small internal alarm. I shouldn't need this. And there's something about being alone that feels particularly, not just comfortable, but right. Most intact, most undisturbed, most complete. If none of that sounds familiar, this distinction may simply not apply. But if there's recognition rather than easy dismissal, that's worth noticing. There's also something worth naming that has nothing to do with individual psychology. Single adults consistently report feeling less supported than people in relationships, not just emotionally, but structurally. Tax systems, healthcare, social events, the general architecture of everyday life, most of it is built around partnership. When the world is designed for couples, staying outside that design carries a real cost. Some of what looks like a preference for being alone may partly be a reasonable response to a world where partnership comes with tangible advantages. The choice doesn't happen in a vacuum.
The distinction isn't a moral one. Neither path is better. Genuine independence tends to have a certain quality to it. Openness, looseness. The person isn't afraid of closeness. They've just found their life genuinely full. The choice doesn't require defending. They could let someone in, they simply haven't needed to. Protective independence is more rigid. It exits before depth develops. It builds a case that sounds reasonable because the case has never had to be seriously tested, and it stays untested precisely because it works. If that second kind developed in you, it wasn't arbitrary. Something made it make sense. The question is just whether the thing that made it make sense is still true now. Here's the paradox. Often, the strongest case for not needing anyone comes from people whose earlier experiences taught them that needing carried a cost. You can't know from inside the architecture whether the choice is yours, or whether the architecture is making the choice for you. That's not a gap in the logic, that's the whole design.